And he will be our peace when the Assyrians invade our land and march through our fortresses. We will raise against them 7 shepherds, even 8 commanders. This is the word of the Lord. I apologize that I ended it right in the middle of a statement, but that's what happened. Um, so this morning, chose this passage because it's quoted by Matthew in his account of Jesus' birth. He quotes this passage explaining why we knew that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem. But before we get into the passage, I think uh, I, for those of you who know me, um, I you know that at my core, I like to be. There's a tendency in my personality that wants to be really alternative. I don't know where it comes from or why. I think I'm just stubborn, and when I see people doing something, I want to do something else. And like this morning, this sermon is kind of embracing that like emotional, edgy, like teen side of my inner being. So I want you to bear with me. Um, so like going along with that, out of all the Christmas hymns that we listen to, there's one that pops up on our like my Spotify playlist that just completely ruins the mood. Okay, there's like one hymn in particular. You may have heard it before. It's O Come, Emmanuel." Have you guys heard this hymn? It ruins the mood because the other hymns are like kind of serene and pretty sounding, and then this one comes on, and it's just like a moody, dark, like very minor key hymn. And here are a couple of the lyrics. The first line, it's O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. Right? It doesn't sound like a typical Christmas hymn. If I continue, O come, thou rod of Jesse, free thine own from Satan's tyranny, from depths of hell, thy people save and give them victory over the grave. Right? It's grungy teen stuff, but it's like grungy teen Christmas. One more verse. O come, thou dayspring from on high, and cheer us by thy drawing nigh. Disperse the gloomy clouds of night, and death's dark shadows put to flight. Right? Um, it's gloomy, it's dark, but the lyrics are redemptive. And um, during this Christmas season, it's really easy for us to get caught up in the cultural Christmas of like the emphasis on joy and of tinsels and jingle bells and lights and gifts and in a large measure that shapes what we think of this season. And for better or for worse, um, that's the way it is. And if you're like me, uh, a lot of many years you have trouble getting into the groove of Christmas because honestly, you're just not feeling that way. You're feeling, if you are like me, like a grumpy, emotional teen, right? And it's hard to get into that Christmas spirit, if you will. But what I want to argue for before us today is that the real wonder, the real power, and the joy of Christmas is most magnified and intensified when we have a grasp of the great need within us that made it necessary. Right? For me, that's the only way that I can get into the joy of Christmas. And so we turn to the book of Micah this morning, and Micah is one of the lesser known minor prophets. The book of Micah was written, and his prophecy and ministry was done during the same time as the prophet Isaiah, roughly. Um, the big name king during his ministry was King Hezekiah. And in his time, the kingdom of Judah was prospering greatly. They were getting really rich. They were succeeding while their northern neighbor of Israel was failing. And the reason for their prosperity was because King Hezekiah had, or the kingdom of Judah had created a treaty with a rising power in the region, the kingdom of Assyria. So while the kingdom of Israel didn't have that treaty, they were suffering. Judah was prospering and growing greatly, but in order to do so, they were serving the Assyrians. And um, because of their prosperity, they were being led into widespread corruption and oppression of the poor, and idolatry was running rampant throughout the country. And so Micah steps onto the scene and he takes on this prophetic ministry. And so, in large part, the short book of Micah is a very negative, gloomy, dark book. There's lots of negative warnings, talking about how God is going to use the power of Assyria as his tool of punishment against his people. Um, there's violence and terror and like repetition of condemnation against Israel's numerous sins. And throughout the book, it's like this, but it's punctuated every once in a while by brief, brilliant moments of hope and promise of God's justice breaking into the world. At first, these messages of hope feel so unexpected and so sudden that it almost feels like it was mistakenly placed there by the author, like a misfiled prophecy, like angry storm clouds, sunshine and rainbows, and then it continues that way. But there's a pattern here that Micah is employing. He talks about condemnation, warning, disaster, and then a promise of justice and the hope that it brings with it. And the passage that we read together this morning is the longest of the breaks in these storm clouds. Right? It's talking about the coming of the Messiah, and it situates it too. It situates it within the context of great suffering. So in chapter 5, verse 1, it starts, marshal your troops now, is how it starts. Um, Marshal your troops now, for a siege is laid against us. They will strike Israel's ruler on the cheek with a rod. A lot of scholars think that the marshal your troops is a mistranslation, and instead it should read like, you slash yourself, daughter Israel, because you're under siege and Israel's ruler is struck with a rod. But even if we don't take that alternative translation, it's clear they're in a really bad spot, right? The rod is a symbol of a king's authority, but instead of Israel's ruler wielding the rod and using it against other people, he's on the receiving end of this, right? This is a statement of national shame that Israel is being treated as a slave, and their greatest king on the throne, even he is just a shameful wretch in the eyes of the nations. Israel's not in a good place. Israel is struggling and suffering. But then comes the rapid shift. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you were small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. Right? And when Micah says this, he touches on a collective, like cultural nerve of the people of Israel. Everyone knows at this time that Bethlehem was the birthplace of their greatest king in their history, King David. Everyone who heard this knew this. And it doesn't make sense to us because we're a modern, fast-paced, forward-looking, postured people. And it doesn't make sense to us that why would in our greatest moment of shame, why would in our greatest moments of trouble, why would Micah tell us to look backwards and look back in the past at heroes of old, right? It doesn't make sense from our pragmatic standpoint. Where like, why should I in my present day troubles look backwards at things that don't affect me right now. At least that's what our modern mindset goes to. And it kind of reminds me of like when I was in high school and I was a student and I'm like studying and things just aren't clicking for me and I'm struggling. And if I usually didn't go complain to my parents because they aren't very good comforters, if you will. But on the rare occasions that I did, it would go just about as well as I thought it would. I would be like, Appa, I don't know, I can't do this. I'm struggling a lot. And then he would be like, Tenya, right? And then he would give me the myth of the Korean parents' genius. I don't know if you guys have heard this. It would be like, Tenya, relax, don't worry. Appa was a genius in high school. Appa was top of the class every single year. I got scholarships to go to college. I'm a genius. And I would sit there and say, in my head, be like, what in the world is that gonna do for me right now? you know, I think his implication was like because you have my genetics, you'll be all right. But I didn't feel that at the moment. I don't. Maybe it was just my parents. Um, I say it's the myth of the Korean parent genius because more often than not, when I talk with my Korean friends, they're like, "Oh yeah, my parents said they were top of the class. My parents said they were top of the class," and the math doesn't math. There's only one spot in the large class. Anyways, the reason I bring that up, like, why? What does past success have to say about my present struggles? Why? What does past? What does my dad's academic success have to do with my present difficulties, right? And Micah, he says, in our greatest day of disaster, in our shame, in our wretched moment, I'm calling on you to look back. There's a hero coming from the town of David, and he's coming, and he's from ancient days. He's from days of old, and he's coming. And obviously, what we know now is that Micah is making this messianic prophecy, right? And when he does this, the people who heard him, like I said, it plucked like a collective cultural nerve, and they all knew what he was talking about. He's talking about David, right? It was probably 250 years or so since David was born, uh, to the point where Micah is making this prophecy. Um, and what he's doing is that he's like making a reference to like a deep cut in Israel's history. He's talking about the promised one. The people were waiting on this promised one, even further back than David, like back to the seed of Abraham, back to the scepter of Israel that's promised in the Pentateuch written by Moses, right? He's promised from such a long time ago, but then in the Davidic covenant, he takes on the title of the Messianic King, right? And this happens in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 14. This is one of the most important passages in the Old Testament, hands down. 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 through 14, to put it into context, David promises God, I want to build you a temple. God sends him the prophet Nathan, telling him, no, you're not the one who's going to build me a temple, but I will give you a son, and this son will build a house for my name. And it waxes and wanes into, like, he's talking about Solomon, but at the same time he's talking about someone greater. And this is what he says: when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. This passage here is the beginnings of the messianic promise, in the sense that when we look at Jesus, we assume, like, oh, of course, it has to be God's son. But where does that idea come from? It comes from this promise that God promised to David, I'm raising up one of your offspring, and essentially he will be my son, and I will be his father. This is where that father-son messianic anticipation comes from. And the people of Israel picked up on it. So we see it in some of the Psalms, like Psalm chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son, and today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. Right? This is what Micah is tapping into here. So when he says, Bethlehem of Ephrathah, even though you're small among the nation or among the tribes of Judah, but out of you is coming someone from days of old. When he says that, the people immediately know he's talking about the coming Messiah. Our pride is laid low. We cut ourselves. We're surrounded and afflicted. But look, the Messiah, the promised Son of God, is coming. This is the anticipation that the people had, and this is the consolation that they were looking forward to, like what Pastor Na was talking about yesterday morning. The consolation of Israel. This is what the people were looking forward to. And what does Micah say about that king, that promised king? If we continue, right? But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. And then verse 3, therefore Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labor bears a son, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites. That's kind of weird, isn't it? Like, I think, like, based on my Christmas experience, what I would expect it to say is, like, you know, the Messiah is coming. Therefore, because the Messiah is coming, let's put up lights and eat too much food at holiday parties and give each other presents, right? Because the Messiah is coming, let's do those things. Let's celebrate. Let's console ourselves. Is the natural human, like what I think the passage should say, but that's not what Micah says. He says, because the Messiah is coming, Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labor bears a son. It's weird, right? And then he continues, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites. What he's talking about, what he's referencing is a coming exile, that the rest of the brothers, they're gone off somewhere, and they will return when the Messiah comes. But what I'm trying to point out to us is that this contradiction in our expectation. We expect, because the Messiah is coming, we should have a foretaste of that victory right now. Because the Messiah is coming, we should celebrate and do things to make ourselves feel better. But instead, Micah says, because the Messiah is coming, therefore Israel will remain abandoned until he comes. Right? Maybe it's just me, and maybe it's just the way that I was, like, again, in my teenage moodiness while I was reading this passage. But I felt as if, like, if I'm being honest, like, I had a really bad year. And maybe some of you might agree. Like, this past year, I faced a lot of disappointments. You know, Jeannie and I tried to get pregnant, and we couldn't for like 6 months. And then we finally had a baby, and then we lost her. It was a bad year. It sucked. It was terrible. And, like, other things happened. I felt like I regressed in my career. I felt like I didn't do as well as I should have in school. And in my present situation, there's a temptation to look at Christmas and treat it like a consolation prize. Like, man, that year sucked. Let's distract ourselves with the lights and the presents and the food, and let me be distracted and entertained and amused, so I don't have to deal with the relentless beat of time that's going to drag me into another year that perhaps might be worse or the same, you know? And I read this passage and I hear what Micah is saying. The Messiah is coming, therefore Israel will remain abandoned. Right? It's so contrary to how I want to feel. I think as humans, when we're sitting in difficulty and misery, we want to console ourselves. We want to self-soothe. We want to self-medicate. We want to give ourselves the immediate comforts in order to distract ourselves from how distressful the situation is. And we forget that we have a good God who is preparing things for us. And instead of trusting his goodness and waiting on his timing, we pick the fruit and we take it and make for ourselves to feel better. You know, are you guys following my logic on this? Like, Micah reminds us that the reason we're excited about the coming Messiah is because our present situation is so miserable. You know, let's not, let's not allow like our Netflix binges and our internet distractions pull us away from the reality that we're in desperate need, that we're waiting and we're wanting and we need something to change, right? And what Micah is telling us is don't go and like build up your armies to overcome the situation yourself. Don't try to build wealth and prosperity for yourself to try to make things right. You know, don't go chase after different things, but put your trust in the promise that God has given. The Messiah is coming, right? The Messiah is coming. And he continues in verse 4, because the Messiah is coming, Israel will be abandoned. And then verse 4, he will stand and he will shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will live securely. For then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth, and he will be our peace when Assyrians invade our land. Right? This Messiah who's coming, he's going to give us real peace. Right? And I talk about it like it's the future because, like Pastor Nas said, we're waiting for Jesus to return. We're waiting for him to come and make things right. But like Micah, we can look back at the past and see what God has done. And because God has done that in our past, we can depend on his trustworthiness for our future. It's not like my dad's supposed genius that has nothing to do with me. I didn't inherit any of it. It's not helpful. You know, it's not like that, right? I look back and Jesus has been so faithful and trustworthy in the past. And therefore, I know he will be faithful and trustworthy in the future. You know, I look back at this past year and I know that Jesus was my peace, even as death visited my family. I look back and I'm reminded that Jesus shepherded me in strength, even when my faith was weak. I look back and I know that I've seen God's glory and his majesty and his goodness in my life, and that he holds me secure even when my life is unsure. And I want to encourage you as well, just like Micah did. Look back. Count the blessings that God has given you this year. Was God faithful to you? Was Jesus trustworthy to you? I look back even further, not even just this past year, but I look back at once upon a time when I was a young and proud and rebellious, hypocritical, religious teen. Jesus stepped into my life and introduced himself to me anyways, you know? And he did so, when I think about it, in order that in times like this past year, I might have his hand to hold. Even before I knew any of that was on the horizon, he had already planned it out and was faithful to me. So like if you're already in the Christmas spirit, that's fantastic. I'm happy for you. But if you're like a grumpy, moody teen like I am, and you need a motivation to get into it, look at the need and look at how God has already answered and how God will answer in the future. Um, Deeper joy is mine because he's walked with me in the darkness. Powerful assurance is mine because God has proven himself faithful, right? He has won it for me, and I ask, has he won that for you? So as we look forward to the new year and the coming Christmas season, um, I say let the new year and its fearful struggles come, Let the uncertainty and the disappointments come. Let kingdoms plot and the nations rage. And through it all, let's sing together, O come, Emmanuel. Come be with us, God. That's the message I have for us today. So let's transition to our time of prayer. And as always, let's take some time to pray for these prayer requests. Prayer of thanksgiving to Jesus for coming into the world. Amen. That he came to seek and save lost like us. Yeah, let's pray these things, and then you can pray your personal prayers as well.